It is a beautiful day to be alive, and I'm so glad we have this time together. I'm Sana Laybourne, she, her. I am a professor, scholar, connector, and avid reader. I've always loved learning about what's happening in our social world and sharing that knowledge, especially over a good cup of coffee. And so here we are. Each week on Let's Grab Coffee, I catch up with experts from around the world who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So go ahead and grab your cup of coffee and get ready for an engaging and insightful conversation. A key part of Memphis history is its role in the civil rights movement, particularly with the Sanitation Workers Strike that brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis and his untimely death. Like the city itself, the story of civil rights activism is often presented through a black-white lens. Yet Asians and Asian Americans have been in the South since at least the late 1700s and in Memphis since the late 1800s. How then do Asian Americans fit into the history of civil rights, the history of our city? And how does knowing that history then change how we think about race, rights, Asian Americans, and the South? To answer these questions and more, today I'm joined by Dr. Stephanie Hinnershitz. Dr. Hinnershitz is an assistant professor of security and military studies at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, where she teaches courses in national security, political affairs and strategy, and contemporary and emerging war fighting. Previously, she served as the senior historian with the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. She is the author of Race, Religion, and Civil Rights, Asian Students on the West Coast, 1900 to 1968, as well as A Different Shade of Justice, Asian American Civil Rights in the South, which won the Silver Nautilus Award for Journalism and Investigative Reporting. She's also the author of Japanese American Incarceration, The Camps and Coerced Labor in World War II, which won the Philip Taft Labor History Award from the Labor and Working Class History Association and Cornell University Labor Relations School. Her work has been funded by the Army Heritage and Education Center, the Social Science Research Council, the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, the Office of Diversity at the United States Military Academy at West Point, the Library of Congress, and the American Council of Learned Societies. She joins us today. Hi, Steph. So glad to have you here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, I was so excited to see your book, A Different Shade of Justice, Asian American Civil Rights in the South, because as an Asian American woman who grew up in Memphis, but who often did not hear about how Asian Americans fit into this story of civil rights, but I've been learning more, particularly as in Memphis, we've acknowledged our over 150-year history of Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, in our community. And I feel like for me personally, and even for our city, there's more interest in really understanding, okay, how do we make sense of this story that we've often told ourselves about Black-white relations or even civil rights when we think about how our Asian American communities fit in? And so I'm just so glad to see your book that's really delving into this exact topic.
Yeah, I was really excited to get into it because I also grew up learning about the civil rights movement as being very black and white, and that there's really no in between. But the more I did research on the topic, and I used to teach at Valdosta State University in Georgia. So that's
Mhm.
initially how I got interested in the topic of Asian Americans in the South and civil rights. But I also learned that there was a little bit of a different path that Asian Americans took to fight for their civil rights in the South. And a lot of those rights were directly connected to what scholars talk about as the otherness of Asian Americans in the US, or this idea that they are, kind of quote, perpetual foreigners, even if they
Mhm.
were born in the United States, but this idea that they are just so, quote, other from the rest of society. So a lot of Asian American civil rights across the country, but in the South, had to take a different, more legal aspect from the get-go. And that's something that I think a lot of people can learn from.
Yeah, I mean, you focus on, like you said, these legal strategies that various Asian ethnic groups, but also I want to be careful with that language because you really talk about individuals, right? So
Yes.
individuals who are members of various Asian ethnic groups, but how they use these different legal strategies to challenge both segregation and discrimination. And what I found really interesting was that in that process, you're really highlighting how Asians were thought about, politically, socially, culturally, and that really fluctuated depending upon a lot of different factors. So I'm thinking about how you talk about immigration law, naturalization law, of course, broader things that are happening globally, and then also, on that national, regional, and local level. And so there's just so much here. And I begin to understand why we have this overly simplistic view of who Asian Americans are, because it really is shifting some of the legal strategies, some of the attitudes, um, you know, year by year, but even almost hour by hour in some cases. And so I'm wondering if you could just kind of get into some of the different competing ways that different Asian groups were thought about.
And you are absolutely right. It really did when it came to the South, it got down to take school segregation, for example,
Hmm.
district by district,
Yeah.
especially in some place like Mississippi, but also in Tennessee and Arkansas. And again, hour by hour. So in the case of Lum v. Rice, which was a Chinese born man who came to the United States and his American born children, and the battle that he took to allow for them to attend white schools, that was a case where literally in the morning, the first day of school, his children were in attendance at the white school. And then by lunchtime, they were basically sent home, and the school told them that they now had to go to the quote, the colored school.
Hmm.
So that a lot of the civil rights battles of Asian Americans were dependent upon how Southern society viewed them. And
Hmm.
it did also get down to, like you mentioned, and it is important to mention the different ethnic groups and how those groups, their identity in a lot of ways was decided by the white community that they often tried to fit into. That was a strategy as well. The legal strategy was in many cases dependent upon finding that middle ground where it was clear that they were not white. They were not
Hmm.
part of white Southern society. But because of the discrimination that was everywhere in a lot of cases, they also tried to push against being defined as Black.
Hmm.
And a lot of that identity was dependent upon things like anti miscegenation laws at the state level. In some states, there were very clear anti miscegenation laws that really did define an Asian immigrant or an Asian American could not marry with a white individual because they were colored,
Hmm.
as opposed to other states that did not specifically mention Asian groups, Asian American groups. So there, the law was a little bit more fluid, and there was some legal room to play around with. So it was really challenging because a lot of the legal strategies for civil rights really depended upon the local, the state level laws in the different southern states. And then also a tactic was for different ethnic groups to define themselves against other ethnic groups.
Hmm.
So for Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans, when you get to the World War II era, trying to define they tried to define themselves as American as opposed to Japanese Americans, which were during World War II faced a different battle. So that was it was interesting, but also complicated and required a lot of work to go into state archives and try and figure things out with what was going on locally at the state level, and then how that all fit with the national level. So a lot of the key battles for Asian Americans in the South really depended upon one, figuring out where they stood in Southern society, and then trying to develop their battles around how they identified. And there were different competing reasons for why it made more sense to identify, at least legally, as white versus colored versus Asian. It was really, historians like to say it was complicated, but it really was very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, even in your book, though, I mean, kudos to you for being able to really distill this very complicated story in ways that are easy to understand, right? Because it's shifting, as you mentioned, it's shifting from even within a state, certain districts, it's shifting over time, it's shifting in terms of, again, just where the US is positioning itself. And so there's so much to kind of grasp onto and try to, figure out, okay, what is at play in this particular instance? Is it going to be the same in another? And in many cases, we see that it's not the same. And so these really were almost individual court cases. And you talk about school segregation cases and anti-miscegenation cases, as well as some others. And I'm wondering for you, even before we get into more of the meat of what you talk about in the book, I'm wondering for you as you started your research, was this something that you expected to find that, oh, these very separate Asian ethnicities are being treated very differently? Or what was kind of your thinking going into it, and how maybe did that change, or what surprised you as you got into some of these archives?
I was not expecting the legal strategies to be quite as different for the different ethnic groups. That was surprising for me, and it probably should not have been as surprising for me as it was. I am white, so I don't have a direct personal connection to different ethnic communities. So for me, it was surprising. The story may not have been surprising for other groups, and
Mhm.
there's this tendency of, white identifying historians to act like history is somehow new, or you'll hear like, oh, the little known story of this
Yeah.
particular racially motivated violent crime, and it's not little known or unknown, but it's unknown to white scholars.
Right.
So so again, maybe I was a little bit naive, but just also not being aware of that. So I was surprised by it. And when I first did research for this book, well, first of all, let me back up. As someone who specialized in Asian American history in graduate school, I fully expected that, one, if I was lucky enough to get a job in
Mhm.
academia, it would more than likely be on the West Coast because of the roots of
Mhm.
that history. But the academic job market is horrible. So,
Yes.
it turns out my first job was at Valdosta State University in Southern Georgia. So I went there. My work on my first book was done for the most part. I was turning that from my dissertation into my first book. But I was thinking, what am I going to do next? What should I study? I didn't know anything about Asian American history in the South. And so I think I was in my office one day, and I pulled up LexisNexis, and I put in, I think, Asian American, but I also put in just specific sort of ethnic groups. And at one point I had put in Filipinos, and lo and behold, there was this court case from the 1930s involving two Filipino men, and how that intersected with some of the bigger themes of that era with Jim Crow South, miscegenation, and just the relationship between Filipino men and larger white society at the time. So then I was curious. I'm like, well, what else is out there? What are the other experiences of different ethnic groups, and how far does that story go? So I was surprised as I just dug deeper into this, how many different experiences there were, but also just how different some of the things that Asian American groups experienced that made their experience connected to the bigger story of race in the United States, but also more unique. And like I mentioned before, a lot of that uniqueness did stem from this idea that they are completely other and they're not American,
Mhm.
and how that was something that these different ethnic groups had to work against.
Absolutely. I'm even thinking about what you said about, some of these histories, we think they're little known, but little known to who, right? Like which groups. But I'm also, this idea of Asian Americans in the South, I feel like it's something that because it's often, again, not how we talk about Asian American history or even Asian America, that it's easy to not know this history unless you're looking for it. And
Mhm,
even
mhm,
when I think about documentaries that are coming out now by Asian Americans, who typically West Coast, East Coast, Asian Americans who find out, oh my goodness, our family has history in the South, and it's even surprising to them. And so, again, the ways that we tell our personal family histories or our national history is really contributing to this idea that Asian Americans weren't present or weren't fighting for their rights, whether individually or seeing themselves as part of a broader collective as well.
mhm,
You
mhm,
talked about this idea, and something that comes up a lot in scholarship and even kind of how we think about Asians kind of more broadly in our society as this perpetual foreigner, as, unable to be citizens or seen as part of what it means to quote unquote be American. And that was actually one of the strategies that you talk about that some folks use in order to really play up this idea of maybe they were immigrants, and so relying on treaties or other pieces of legislation to try to fight for certain rights. Could you talk a little bit more about how different cases that you uncovered or you studied really use this language, kind of attempting to use it into their advantage anyway?
mhm. In a lot of cases that I discovered, it actually made sense for, especially if you take Chinese migrants to the US. So it actually made sense for them to depend upon their immigrant status because, like you mentioned, it is connected or was connected to treaty rights between the United States and China, for example. So going way back 1860s, there was an agreement that was struck up between the Chinese government and the American government that in exchange for allowing the United States basically access to Chinese markets, the United States would agree that governments, whether it was local or state level or national level, would recognize Chinese migrants and give them, quote, First Nation status, meaning that their children would be able to attend white schools. They would not experience discrimination. And so when you have cases like the Lum v. Rice case in Mississippi in the 20s, it made more sense for that group to rely upon the fact that they are not part of this racial structure. Then maybe they're
Mhm.
not white, but they're certainly not colored. And the reason for that is because they're using these bigger treaties and these federal level agreements to argue for their unique status. And that's something that other groups use as well, especially in the school segregation cases. So for Filipinos, there was also a lot of instances of Filipinos who will fight for their access to be able to attend white schools. And they will depend upon their status at the time, which is very unique and interesting,
Mhm.
where they were not citizens, but because of the colonial relationship between the United States and the Philippines, they were, quote, American nationals. So their argument was sort of forget about the treaties between the US and China. We are technically American. And
Mhm.
so, therefore, we deserve special privilege as Americans. So, I think that's a good example of where the international structure and what's going on internationally and globally with diplomatic history had an impact on the fight for civil rights in these different ethnic groups that wasn't quite the same as for Black Americans in the South fighting for their civil rights. So it is very complicated because on one hand you have groups who are trying to prove that they are not these sort of unassimilable others, but on the other hand, legally it made some sense for these groups to argue that because they were immigrants, they did have special rights. And if you violate their civil rights, then technically you're violating international treaties, which is
Right.
not good.
Yeah, we don't want to do that.
Not good, not good. So it was just very interesting to find the deeper level of that. And it's something that, going back to something you mentioned earlier, that there are similarities between the South and Asian American ethnic groups on the West Coast and their battle for civil rights. There are similarities, but it is also different. And there was certainly discrimination on the West Coast, 100%. This The landscape of something like school segregation gets a little bit complicated on the West Coast, just like it's complicated in the South. But in a lot of ways, because of the presence of sort of formal Jim Crow school segregation in the South, it does get down to that local level a little bit more. And I think it is important. It is a good trend. I'm glad it's happening that Asian American history for so long had been dominated by the West Coast. And it makes sense that, I mean, huge community there. And then moved out further to the East Coast, New York City, the big urban areas. And what was lost was the South and the Midwest. And both of those areas are starting to become more integrated into this bigger story. And I don't know quite as much about like the Midwest and the Great Lakes region, that story there, Chicago, but those stories are beginning to be told. So I think it'll be interesting to look at, well, what were the civil rights struggles there and how were they different in the North when, quote, so many people believe there was no discrimination legally, maybe not, but socially and culturally, what does it look like to be Asian American and fighting for civil rights in a region that did not have that long sort of legal history of segregation, as in some place like the Jim Crow South? That was a very long answer to your to your question, but it touched on a lot of different things. It was a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about too, even in your very long answer, which was perfect because it gave me so much more to even think about. One, as you mentioned, I think even in the past handful of years, we've seen, I think, growing efforts to really document some of this Asian American history, particularly in the South, which is what I have my eye towards, of course, being here in Memphis. So I'm thinking about efforts by, I think it's the Dallas Historical Society, and then also in St. Louis right now, they're doing an oral history project. I know some folks in Indianapolis also similar, trying to record and even recover some of that Asian American history as well. And so I think over the next coming years, we will see more of this analysis into, okay, what did Asian American civil rights or just Asian American participation in society look like at that time in ways that we haven't been thinking about because we had this very, neat history that was confined to maybe West Coast, East Coast, alien land laws on the West Coast, Japanese internment, and maybe those small pieces. But now we're getting a much more nuanced story. And I can see why it can be difficult for people to grasp because it fluctuated. Like these stories fluctuate, these laws, the policies, the applications really fluctuated over time. But also, as we've kind of touched on throughout our conversation so far, on the local level. And I think that's what really captured me the most from what you shared in your book, which was how these local attitudes varied so much within, even if we take one state at a time. And what I was really surprised by was you talked about in Louisiana, but then also in Florida, how you saw elected officials in areas that really had no Asian American presence really push for these very anti-Asian pieces of legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the actual locales in that state where communities had Asian Americans, they were finding a way to kind of coexist together.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how we see, I guess, maybe national attitudes shaping individual attitudes when there is no interracial contact, or
Mm-hmm.
even if you thought there was some sort of tipping point for how many Asian American families might be in an area and how that would shift positive or negative kind of attitudes in the community.
Mm-hmm. If you look at states, especially like Florida, Texas, and Louisiana, so after the Civil War, there's a big push in those states, and especially areas that had once relied upon cotton.
Mhm.
So that once relied upon that was a key crop after the Civil War. There are changes in the labor structure in the South, so transitioning from slavery to sharecropping to, by the time you get to the mid 20th century, this idea that this is, quote, free labor. And we know that there's so many different contingents upon that that does not make it free. But
Mhm.
after the Civil War, you have a lot of southern areas that had once been dependent upon cotton. They're looking to diversify their crops. And so, because of some of these treaties, especially between the United States and Japan, you see some of these like local booster clubs, these local commerce clubs in areas around Houston or in southern Louisiana turn to Japan and to start to look at, are there any groups who would be interested in coming over to the United States, settling in these areas and trying to grow crops like rice, for example. So
Mhm.
how to bring back like the rice industry in the areas around southern Texas and southern Louisiana that would benefit. If you look at some place like Florida, around what will become Miami, but some of the areas there, same thing. During the 1920s, there's a big land boom. So land will be speculated in, which will lead directly into the Great Depression. But there's a real desire to bring tourists down to that area of Florida. So same thing there. You have swampy land. It's not very well positioned to grow cash crops. And so you have local groups that will turn to Japanese farmers and say, would you like to come here and help us revitalize? In those pockets, initially, Japanese migrants and businessmen and farmers who come over in the very early 20th century, they're received well because they're seen as an economic benefit to these areas because they're wealthier landowners. There's not going to be direct competition with manual labor at the time. So the white communities there are very receptive to them. These communities are not big comparatively. So,
Mhm.
especially in Florida, we're talking about like a handful of Japanese families. Same thing in Louisiana and these rice parishes. There's not a lot. So things start to change. You can trace it back to the Russo-Japanese War. So 1904, 1905, you have Japan and Russia will be at war over their own interest in Japan. Japan will win, and this is a big shock to the whole world. The whole world
Mhm.
is really surprised that you have these Japanese forces are able to overthrow this really powerful Western, quote, Western European nation. And so you see things take two different paths in the United States and white attitudes toward Japanese migrants. Some white individuals are very impressed by this and they
Mhm.
see, like, all right, now you've got these Japanese farmers in this land. You have them becoming military, like having a lot of military might. So this is good. These are people to be respected. In other areas, especially in areas that you do not necessarily see a lot of Japanese migrants, there's a fear that, oh crap, the Japanese are now becoming military powerhouses. Are they going to start to expand and colonize and move farther west or further
Mhm.
east? I have to think geography wise, and become colonial rulers as they start to establish themselves in these different communities. When you see California, in response to that, start to
Mhm.
pass a lot of anti-alien land laws, then you see areas where there are virtually no Japanese communities, like certain areas of Louisiana. Well, they will want to do similar things and pass similar anti-alien land laws because they don't want Japanese fleeing from the California anti-alien land laws and then settling in their regions. So it really depended upon locally how important Japanese farmers are to the economy, but then those attitudes are running against broader nationwide attitudes against the Japanese as the US becomes fearful that because they are becoming more powerful, Japan might be a threat in the Pacific to American interests and then also to basically American communities in the United States. So it flip-flops quickly. And even at the national level, where you have suspicion of Japan down to the local level, you could have, and you did see local communities writing in editorials and actually wanting the law to change to be able to make and allow Japanese to naturalize and become
Mhm.
citizens. You have those calls coming at the same time that you're hearing people panic on the West Coast and say we need to restrict Japanese migration because this is just all part of a Japanese invasion of the United States. Those are two very different things, but the thing that brings them and ties them together is that these are Americans defining Japanese and what they are based on how they fit into their society. So in the South, if you got very sort of wealthy Japanese rice farmers who are contributing to the economy, communities might be able to overlook national trends. But at the same time, if you have counties that are near some of these rice growing communities, for example, who have no Japanese migrants, then they might be inclined to say we need to pass some kind of anti-alien land law to prevent more Japanese from being able to settle in the South. It's complicated.
It's so
It's complicated.
complicated. But I love how complicated it is, right? History is not as clear cut as we want to make it seem. It is
Yeah.
very complicated. And what I really appreciate about your research in this book is that you have to hold all these different almost conflicting ideas at one
Mhm.
time in your mind, right? And really wrestle with how were people, in different parts of a state or different regions of the country really making sense of this idea of, who Asian Americans are, or specifically who Japanese are, or Chinese are, Filipinos. And what really came out to me throughout the different time periods and different ethnic groups that you talk about is exactly what you just mentioned, is how white Americans are really defining these distinct groups um, in response to how they're being received or contributing, or how they see their contribution to their local communities. And I'm thinking about just that idea of, interest convergence, right? When it is beneficial to the white community in these districts or in these communities, then they want to, or it seems like they're fighting for Asian Americans' rights. Maybe, maybe not. More so fighting to maintain, their power and their position in the power structure as white folks in this, racial order. But it does in some ways benefit the Asian Americans in those communities in varying ways.
Yeah, and that's also a good point because something that I wanted to try and make clear in my book was that this is not the Asian rights movement of the late 60s. And even then,
Right.
of course, like different ethnic groups, their rights and their battles are not always the same. But these are not in the early 20th century. These are primarily not different ethnic groups fighting for the rights of all Asian migrants or all Asian Americans. That was really, really important about this. They are very individualistic, and even down to you have some Chinese families that, for instance, don't really care about what or how Chinese migrants are accepted broadly or across the South. They're very, I want my kids to go to the best school possible. I need to prove that I am an upstanding, Christian middle class individual who fits in with white society. So I'm glad you brought that up because that is also very important. A real key difference between what you will see inspired by the civil rights movement of the 60s
Mhm.
versus what I focus on, the groups that I focus on. And this is not an Asian rights movement in the South at this time. This is very individualistic and very driven by economics, by social status, socioeconomic status. I almost forgot to bring that up. So that is a very, very key part of this book. Just what are the goals? And we're not in the early 20th century in the South. We're certainly not at the point where you're seeing the type of activism that comes out of the late 1960s. So I'm glad you brought that up because that was something I really wanted to emphasize in this book.
And I'm wondering if that's part of the reason why we don't hear much about this Asian activism, is because it doesn't fit into that model that, contemporarily we think of when we think of a civil rights movement. We think about a pan-ethnic or interracial or very broad movement that's encompassing more than just surely more than just an individual family, right? And so I'm wondering if that's part of the reason, in addition to many other reasons that I could think of, why we don't really focus on or hear about these legal battles throughout the South.
I think that is a huge part of it. I also think it has to do with the type of activism that these early activists are engaging in. I know when I wrote my first book, which was it was so super specific because it was a dissertation. So it was very, very specific. But I tried to make the argument that some of these students who migrated from Japan and China and the Philippines were these kind of natal activist, part of the West Coast movement, but well before the 1960s. But I had a really hard time trying to sell that argument to many people because their argument was these are not activists because one, they're looking out for their very small socioeconomic group. These are elites that are being sent from their nations. It's the goals, the overall goals are not necessarily there, but also I remember having a conversation with a librarian at UCLA, and when I told them my topic, they said, there's no real activism amongst these groups. And one of the reasons I think we got into a conversation a little bit more about this was that the activism was not broad and sweeping. The activism was very, quote, respectable. These kids were not marching. They were not really putting themselves out there. In a way, they were because they could be sent home at any point. But it doesn't fit that mindset that we have or that frame of mind about what is activism. I think that's similar to A Different Shade of Justice because, I've talked with people about this book, and some people might feel a little bit disappointed because of how individualistic a lot of these fights were, and because so many of the groups were trying to distance themselves from other minority groups. Mm-hmm. And of course, it would be great if everyone joined together, but it's just we're not at that point historically. And there are still issues with that today, more recently, of course, with the affirmative action and minority issues and with acceptance and admission at like Harvard, but it's just not there. And part of the constraint is how do you navigate that system? So I think you're absolutely right. It just doesn't fit with the narrative that we have become so used to. And model minority identity plays into this in a big way as well. So I constantly have run up against the idea that Asian Americans were not activists until the 1960s because that's when they became activists and they had to be inspired by the civil rights movement. And before that, they were quiet and they accepted their status and they're just not interested in that type of activism. But the activism just looks different. And some people have argued it's sort of self-serving. And yeah, I mean, of course, these are individuals who are fighting for rights for their family members to be able to own property and to be able to send their kids to the better schools. But it's just it doesn't align well with what we think of when we think of the civil rights history in the United States. But I also did want to say, especially in places like the North, there were plenty of Black families who did the same thing. They took the same strategy of thinking more about how to play into these respectability politics, if you will, and how do you navigate that. So in some ways it's very similar, but in others, I think when you throw in the immigration status and you throw in the international picture, it complicates things a little bit. And you have to think about what does activism look like for a Filipino man in Georgia when they are American nationals? What kind of rights do they actually have? Do they have access to the same constitutional rights as other Americans? There are plenty of justice systems in the South that tried to say, no, they don't have the same rights. And it was a big job. It was up to the Filipino community themselves to say, yes, we do. Yes, we do have access to the same constitutional rights. I'm going way into detail. I don't quite remember what you originally said, but thank you, because I had an opportunity to talk a lot about that.
Yes. I mean, you write in the book, you say the problem lies in how we define civil rights, its boundaries, and its activists. And in this case, you were talking specifically about some of the cases of Indian American hotel owners in this case, because you say, they use strategies and tactics to fight against racism that were often different from those of Asian Americans before them and also African Americans. But I mean, that's exactly, the point that we're talking about is how activism looks is very different. And again, some of those are constraints around, how, in this case, Asian Americans are being defined and seen as people, as
Mhm.
citizens, as, as a specific members of specific ethnic groups. And so those challenges and opportunities for even fighting for their rights or fighting against different systems of discrimination and segregation, it just goes back to, it's complicated, which sometimes seems like, oh, it's such a cop out, but it's really true. It's so complex.
Mhm.
Um, and, you mentioned thinking about how oftentimes, when we talk about Asian American activism, it's very much centered around the student movement in the 1960s and thinking again back to the West Coast. And as I was reading your book, it made me think about a few different things. So, one, again, just the importance of space and place, and how activism is being shaped, or even how Asian Americans are thinking about themselves. But then it also made me wonder, what was gained or maybe even lost in using that pan-ethnic identifier as Asian Americans? Because when I read your book and think about the different cases, for the people who are filing, again, these very individual, legal battles, it was to their advantage at that particular time to really base their arguments on their specific ethnic group and their positioning in the political system at that time. Whereas identifying as Asian American, that wasn't even an idea back then, would have not been a benefit. So I'm wondering, what do you think about the introduction and the use of that pan ethnic label of Asian American in terms of fighting for civil rights?
Mhm. I, in thinking through this, I believe that the difference is I just spent I don't know how many minutes talking about the difference between between early 20th century and then the late 1960s. But maybe there's not quite as big of a difference as I originally thought. So it's fun to be able to like argue against yourself. So I'm going to argue against
Yeah.
myself because in the late 60s, if you take California, for example, there are a lot of movements that are very locally based. So, especially things like mental health. So,
Mhm.
having and helping recent communities like Vietnamese refugees throughout the 70s and the early 80s. And at the community level, a lot of student groups work to help them get access to healthcare and get access to mental health care, especially. Same thing with Filipino migrants who came over in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. That's similar to the type of activism that these groups took in the early 20th century in the South. Not
Mhm.
exactly the same, different goals, different movements, and different times, but there's definitely that local element that does end up being specific to different ethnic groups based on their specific challenges. And there again, you have the international picture, what's going on over in Vietnam that led to some of these migrants being forced to come here because they had no other choice, or some of the members of the Vietnamese or the South Vietnamese army who came to the United States as part of a bigger military agreement. And those are very localized fights. Those are localized movements to help a specific population that's settled in a specific area to get access to certain rights. So there are similarities there. It's not exactly one versus the other, or what happened in the early 20th century is entirely different from what happened in the late 1960s. And maybe that gets lost a little bit. And I think I lost that a little bit when I was writing that book. So I'm very grateful you asked that question because it allowed me to rethink things a little bit. And maybe I was too quick to not draw that connection. But I think it is certainly there. Like you mentioned, space and time are really, really important when you're looking at Asian American civil rights. And I want someone to write that book. I don't necessarily like I want to read it. I need a little bit of a break from writing, but I want to read that book. So
Yeah.
someone write that book,
Yeah,
please.
someone needs to write that book. I want to read that book too.
Be
I think,
great.
yeah, I think I'm just really a little obsessed right now with the idea of space and place and how, I think we often want to have these very easy narratives, very uncomplicated stories to help us make sense of the world that we live in. But it's very complicated and it's very messy because it's just stories about people, and people
Yeah.
are, we're complicated and messy.
Yeah, and I also hear just a bigger criticism from historians, older, more established historians, who one of their criticisms about what's being done now amongst younger scholars and more diverse scholars is that everything is, quote, microhistory now. So the argument is we've gotten so far outside of a bigger narrative, and now everything that's done is what does civil rights look like in this very small town, in this local community, that, and the argument is somehow we've lost sight of a bigger narrative that draws all these stories in together. And what you and I have just talked about is it is, there's still a narrative there. It's just how can you get at it and usefully not downplay the differences between these different ethnic and racial groups and communities, but still bring it up to the level and look at, well, what is making all of this possible? So all this criticism that all grad students, for example, now who are doing it's all microhistory, it's microhistory. Well, how else are you going to get at these experiences and do the research and have the building blocks so that some future unknown right now scholar maybe can come along and write the big space and time and place book? But you need to do that work, and it's not fair to dismiss microhistory as microhistory when I don't know how you get to the bigger narrative unless we are doing that work that local groups are doing to sort of tell these stories at least by white scholars in the master narrative of American history have been so overlooked. So that I just got on my soapbox a little bit, but I will step down.
We love a soapbox on this show. We absolutely love it because, I was thinking as I was reading your book, how much do we lose when we only see kind of these big master narratives, or when we get lost in these bigger trends? Sometimes we do have to get to the very specific. And it's through the specific that we realize, oh, wait a minute, maybe this big story that I thought I had isn't actually as clear cut as we've been telling
Yeah.
it all this time. And I think
Yeah.
that's really the strength of this book, is it brings up a lot of questions that certainly, more people are asking today, right?
Mhm.
About, for example, in the South, how did Asian Americans fit into this story? We know that we've been here, but what did it actually look like? And for a lot of the time, how we have thought about, U.S. Southern history, Asian Americans haven't been part of that story.
Mhm. I do want to also, if I could go back and maybe redo this book, because this is a useful criticism that I do receive, and one of the big glaring glaring omissions from it is the Korean American community. So I do get asked a lot, what kind of struggles did the Korean American community face? Is it different? Is it the same? And my easy answer is I basically, like, I followed the archives. I went from one to the other. I was interested in the legal challenges. But I live in Montgomery, Alabama now. And before I moved here, I had no idea about the large Korean American community that really grew up around the big auto plants, so Kia and Hyundai. I had no idea. I was sort of trained as an immigration historian. I should have known that, but I didn't until I moved here. And then I learned about the very interesting relationship that the Korean American community has with Montgomery. So Montgomery being very deeply red, we are red state and politically. And so on the surface, people might be inclined to think that that community is not accepted at all.
Mhm.
But it's very similar to what I looked at in my book earlier. Locally, how does locality, space, and time affect that? Economically and culturally, the Korean American community has done a lot for Montgomery. So there are a lot of members of the Montgomery community that love to go and eat Korean food, and they love to go have Korean barbecue, and they love karaoke. And the Montgomery Biscuits, which is our local, whatever, double A minor league baseball team, like twice during the season, they become the Montgomery Kimchi for Korean American Appreciation Night. And everyone loves it. They're like, it's kimchi night. This is great. But on the flip side, what do you lose by looking at that and saying, "Wow, the Korean American community in Montgomery is doing great because everyone loves kimchi night and everyone loves Korean barbecue." But that's, I would argue, similar to what different ethnic groups experienced at other times in the South. Economically, culturally, a lot of communities would take what they wanted and then not fully understand the challenges that they face. So I would, if I could go back and add like another chapter, I would love to add a chapter on the Korean American community because I truthfully I don't know much about the longer history of that community in the early 20th century. I know there were students who came and studied at places like Emory who came from
Mm-hmm.
Korea. There's a lot of scholars who are starting to do work on that as well, but I would want to delve more into that. And but again, I like what was different about the Korean American community that grew up in Montgomery around an economic revitalization. So there could be a lot of connections between the Japanese migrants who helped southern areas flourish economically after the Civil War. Is that something similar in Alabama post deindustrialization? Yeah, I don't know. I think that'd be really interesting. And that is an area that I did not look into. And now I feel like, whew, there's a lot that you could do with that.
I know. I'm like, sounds like another book, or, at least an article, something public facing to get started, and
Yeah,
then see
yeah,
where the archives take you.
yeah.
Because again, that piece about the economy and how we're feeling in certain industries or contributing to the revitalization of local communities, definitely a story throughout the book that you did write, and then potentially, these other time, place, communities, ethnic groups, these stories are continuing to unfold. Even as you were talking, it made me think about Blue Oval that's coming to Tennessee. And again, thinking about industry contributions to our state's economy and what those changing or not attitudes might look like, right, over time. And so there's definitely a lot to consider. And I think once you start digging into history, it's like you just continue to find more and more. But at some point, you have to say, hey, this is the book. And this is, you have to stop it at some point.
Yes, yeah, at some point.
Yeah, at some point. And, similar with our time today, we have to stop it, unfortunately, at some point. So for listeners, this was just a little bit, this was a lot, but also a little bit, right? It's always complicated. It's the both and, because you have this great chapter about Indian American hotel owners and really focusing on Tennessee. So for all my Memphis listeners and Tennessee listeners, you'll want to check out the book so you can get that story, which is it will bring, that's a whole nother conversation. There is so much there. Again, those questions of what is civil rights? How are we thinking about it differently depending upon our own positionality? But just overall, a really great read, very illuminating, and left me with way more questions, which I think is always the hallmark of a great book, right? It leaves you even so much more unsure of what you thought you knew. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Thank you again to Dr. Stephanie Hinnershitz. Her book is A Different Shade of Justice, Asian American Civil Rights in the South. And she also mentioned, and I also mentioned in her introduction, she's also the author of Race, Religion, and Civil Rights, Asian Students on the West Coast, 1900 to 1968, and Japanese American Incarceration, the Camps and Coerced Labor in World War II. Of course, today, most of our conversation centered around a different shade of justice, Asian American civil rights in the South. And we could have talked for hours longer because there's so much information in this book. As we said repeatedly, it's complicated. And so I encourage you to grab this book because look, it is complicated. And you're going to probably be like me and have all your notes in the margins as well, because there's just so much information here that you probably never thought about. And I have to tell you, yes, she talks about Memphis in the book. And then I mentioned that she also has a chapter about Indian American hotel owners in Tennessee and some of the ways that they were fighting for not just their civil rights, but also to end discrimination and to end bias that they were experiencing in the hotel industry. So you definitely want to pick up this title and learn more. Well, this has been another Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM Memphis. I'm Sana, and I'm here every Monday morning learning about the world around us, sharing that information with you. I have so much more to just think about within this broader topic of Asian American civil rights in the South, and I'm sure that you do as well. I just love being able to learn more about our own Southern history and rethink some of the narratives that maybe we've grown up with that have really shaped how we thought about ourselves, our community, and the world around us. And so I'm really excited to continue this exploration into our Memphis history and into our Southern history. Well, I want to leave you with this positive note, this reminder that each and every day you get to decide. Yes, you get to decide what type of day it's going to be and how you're going to show up in this world. Over time, those daily choices create not only your life, but the world around us. So, what are you creating? I hope that you will create the time to come back and join me next Monday here on Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR. Until then, make sure you subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format so you never miss a conversation. Also, go ahead and share it with a friend. Go back, listen to the episode, because I'm sure there were bits and pieces in our conversation today that you're like, wait a minute, what? I had no idea. And that's why it's so great that we have Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format. Well, I will see you back here next Monday morning.